So I'm thinking about changing my title to actually Old Rat at the Barn. I think that might be more appropriate. I have to warn you, it's a little dangerous to invite a Southern boy up here to preach right before lunch. We're slow to get started and even slower to finish. Though I must confess that I've been very impressed by farmers who live in cold places like this where you could die on the way to the mailbox in the wintertime. I also would say on a more solemn note that we're having a rough patch down in the States right now. And we would like to continue to look to you as our wise neighbors to the north for a more reasonable and rational way forward. And we also may be on the verge of a new farm crisis in industrial agriculture. And we need to reach out to our farmer neighbors and offer them support and a pathway to organic if they're willing. I'm also proud to be here because this is where organic farmers were early leaders and rose up and challenged Monsanto over GMO contamination of canola. That fight is obviously not over. I thank you for your courage, and many thanks to wherever there, Marla and all the gang for inviting me up here. I am indeed honored. I hope to try to cover 4 things that will lead into this conversation more deeply about regenerative organic. I want to think a little bit on how and why organic has become successful, and to highlight some of the challenges that we now have that come with this success. I'm going to try to explain why I left the farm and got involved a little bit, and then speak about some of the larger macro challenges that we find ourselves in organic embedded in, and we must find urgent attention to address. And then finally suggest a few strategies moving forward. So organic agriculture has certainly come a long way in my lifetime. Organic sales now hover between $60 and $80 billion worldwide, with North America being the largest market. We've made great progress, and we have much to be proud of. Strong environmental standards, improved animal welfare, strong consumer support, avoidance of toxic pesticides, GMOs, antibiotic exposures, adoption of sound soil building practices. And we have gained much visibility and growth through the development of governmental regulatory oversight worldwide. We have hundreds of thousands of farmers with access to new markets, and this strong claim brings a better pay price for farmers who convert to organic. This is something to be proud of. And if I had to reflect on what were 3 things that were probably the most important 3 things on why we've been so successful to date, I would say 1, it works on the ground. It's common sense farming, long rotation, diversity of crops, feed the soil. It's a whole system. Organic is not input substitution. It's not farming neglect. It is a high management system that depends on the right ratio of eyes to acres and careful observation. Secondly, it's transparent and evidence-based approach. How foods become organic is crucial. It is a full chain approach that protects organic integrity from the seed to the retail, and is based on these consistent, verifiable standards that are vetted through a public process and verified by trained inspectors and certifiers and overseen by accreditors. This is a sound process that has encouraged and earned consumer support. And thirdly, and most important, I think, is that we tapped into one of the most powerful tools that all of us possess. Give consumers and all of us what we want. When you vote with your food dollars, every day you're voting for the kind of food system you want. That's very powerful. And what we find is that as these consumers begin to buy organic, they want to know more. They first wanted to know, well, who are you? And how do you grow it? And where are you? And then they wanted to know, well, how are you treating your animals? And then they said, well, how are these farmers getting treated? How are they getting paid? What about the workers? So the more they know, the more they want to know. And they have indicated that they would pay more if this was all true and verified. So the recipe that got us here today is a combination of three things: the right practices on the ground, market reward with consumer support and trust, and linked to supportive policies that reward, protect, and verify these practices. This is what created the paradigm shift and opened up this otherwise very predatory marketplace for this to grow. But of course, now that we have moved from the fringe into the mainstream, we now have new challenges that we did not have before. We're now faced with rapid growth where the demand for organic, the production cannot keep up with the demand. We're outstripping that and having to import many crops that we could grow here at home. We're having to import from China and the Eastern Bloc and many places that are stretching and exacerbating our ability to provide oversight. We need to develop strategies to close the domestic demand and supply gaps for crops that can be grown here at home. Secondly, we're also outstripping our resources in terms of federal and international staffing and resources to oversee this system. We need to strengthen our collective calls for additional resources, not only for solving organic research bottlenecks, but more resources for additional oversight and protection of the operations that are fully compliant. Thirdly, we're now facing downward pressure. As new players enter into the organic system, some are attempting to lower or allow practices and standards to gain faster or larger access to the organic marketplace, such as hydroponic or confinement of livestock operations. We need to be more in solidarity and collective opposition to any attempts to undermine our current standards or laws. Our consumer trust is at stake. The governmental regulatory process also is a very slow process to be able to improve and innovate, especially since the organic system is based on continuous quality improvement. And then I think the challenge also to this new mainstreaming of organic is that when we were developing and incorporating organic into the federal standards, it was a bit like pounding a square peg into a round hole. Some of the corners flew off in that process. And we've been ever since trying to figure out how to graft those pieces back onto our claim. We did not set out to just protect the soil and the water and the land and the animals and the bees and the earthworms. We set out to also protect the people. It was a holistic model. It must be holistic. So now is the time that we should be using the marketplace to pilot and ground truth additional innovations to strengthen our claim to ensure that we continue to be the gold standard for food. But before we dig deeper into some of the macro challenges that we now are embedded in, I want to explain a little bit why I left farming. I did farm largely on the 1970s and converted to organic. While difficult, we found that it was a much better way of life. We liked getting up in the morning. We liked not having to argue who was going to go spray that day. But it was also the late fringe period, and there was no infrastructure. There was no extension. There was no credit. There was very little research, and there was hardly a market. It was mostly word of mouth, and you found a mentor, and it was farmer to farmer. So we were able to grow far more than the market could buy, and we ended up selling most of it as conventional prices to conventional markets. And I thought, well, the problem is, it's just that the policies are just plain wrong-headed. It's kind of what we called back home in Texas, just plain ass backwards. We're rewarding farmers for the wrong thing, and we are penalizing them for the right thing. So I thought, oh, I'll just go fix that. So I joined the Rural Advancement Foundation, who traces its roots back to the 1930s. We were in the midst of a U.S. farm crisis in the early 1980s. We were losing hundreds of thousands of family farmers to foreclosure because of bad agricultural policy. This was the get big or get out period. If you weren't making any money, what'd you need to do? Get a bigger truck. It was the beginning of the dismantling of many of our supply management programs that had served farmers so well since the Great Depression. I also lost my uncle and his farm, and so in many ways this is also personal to me. But I also got a little report in the mail from RAFI that said something's going on in the seed industry. Mom and pop seed companies are being bought by chemical companies. What's that about? Why is Monsanto buying seed companies? This does not portend well. This was the beginning of the biotech era, the new industrial solution that would solve all our problems. And then finally, we needed a viable alternative to the industrial model. It makes no sense to just help save family farms from foreclosure if they could not make a living. We needed another choice. We needed a better way. So I thought I'd take this break, save these farms, protect farmers' rights, and fix organic, and be right back to farming. Well, that was nearly 40 years ago. It turns out that changing agricultural policy is much more like watching a tractor rust than plowing a field. It does happen. It just is usually very slow. So as a community, it took us 10 years to pass organic legislation in the U.S. It then took our National Organic Standards Board, which I was on, another 5 years to write the standards, and then it took the government another 5 years to implement it. We did pass international organic standards through the UN in 8 years, and that was considered a record. So I think we need to step back now and say, we are in the mainstream now. We're not over in the fringe. We are not ignored now. The spotlight is on us, and we are fully susceptible to all of the macro ag trends that are wreaking havoc in industrial agriculture today. Many of these trends were what many of us left that model for, to get away from. So I think we must dig deeper into understanding this larger context if we are to stay ahead of the curve, ahead of the wolf, and ahead of co-optation. Our future will be determined by how successfully we can navigate around these macro challenges during this next period of time. We have to think about agriculture and our world as these two very bipolar, opposite directions that we are struggling for the future of agriculture. One approach is this ever-increasing industrial form of agriculture based on the notion that we can beat nature with pesticides, we can beat it with GMOs, we can beat it with vertical integration, we can beat it with global concentration, versus this regional adapted agroecology regenerative approach, of which organic is the main market-based example. It is based on a place and a taste and a face and, yes, an attitude. It must be a way for family farmers and workers to farm with nature, to farm with dignity, to stay on the land, and to be able to pass it on to the next generation. So while we in organic are faithfully heading in this opposite direction, we remain fully embedded in this much larger macro trends that are challenging our world today. We must emerge as leaders and solution makers. We must also never forget that we were told over and over from the very beginning, this cannot work. You will never grow. This is a fad. It will go away. We're still here. We're still growing. So it's the same as it was then. It was impossible then, and they will say it is impossible now. So if I put on my anthropology hat for a minute, I would say that humans emerged about 180,000 years ago, and agriculture was mostly hunter-gatherer and nomadic. And around 12,000 years ago, agriculture as we know it settled down. This seems like a very long time, which it is. But we still have a very long time to live here longer than the dinosaurs, who were around for 160 million years, and they're all gone. So most of the crops, the diversity, the farmer techniques that we all enjoy today are because farmers were innovators and they passed these techniques on. They bred and they selected and they protected the seeds and the animals, especially in what we call the centers of biodiversity. Coffee comes from Ethiopia, small grains from Eurasia, potatoes and cotton from Peru, sunflowers and berries from North America. These seeds traveled with people as we migrated. Back then, humans had to accept the world as they found it. The only evidence we can find for back then are in bones and stone and metal and seeds. However, today, there is strong agreement that we as a planet have now entered into a new evolutionary period called the Anthropocene. This is a new era where human influences are actually changing our environment and our future trajectory of our planet for the first time in our history. We are also leaving what is called the high caloric period and moving into a neo-caloric period. This is the beginning of a post-industrial world, post-petroleum world, where energy efficiency, growth of alternative energy, and practice will be essential to our future adaptability. Organic must be on the cutting edge of these realities. Climate change is upon us. We have witnessed 26 full 500-year weather events in the last 10 years. My region had 2 such events this year. We had over 50 inches of rain on the coast of North Carolina this fall alone. So we must be perfecting our on-farm carbon sequestration techniques. We must be embracing alternative energy solutions for our operations. Secondly, we are faced with corporate concentration. Walmart and Amazon are competing for who will control the retail food market. We already have 3 seed chemical giant companies that control 70% of the global commercial seeds and the chemical inputs. We must be supporting localized community and farmer-owned value infrastructure to ensure that our farmers have choices of getting our product to the market, and we must find viable choice, because without competition, I can tell you, mean things happen. We also are witnessing the loss of farmers and worker rights. This must be understood as the relative negotiating position of individual farmers and workers versus mega multinational corporations. Declining share of farmers' share of the food dollars. Farmers and workers losing their rights to negotiate a fair contract. And we, most importantly, have been tracking this loss of rights of farmers to save seeds. I want to be very clear that this is a recipe for global insecurity and the uprooting of farmers from the land. We have never before witnessed this unprecedented cultural shift from farmers as breeders to farmers as renters of patented germplasm. So we must be piloting and developing ways to add farmer and worker rights onto our organic claim to ensure fair contracts, to ensure fair pay, fair wages, and greater transparency of price taking across our system. We must be defending farmers and breeders' rights to save and share seeds. And we must oppose utility patents in organic agriculture seed production. We are also witnessing the erosion of agricultural biodiversity. The UN says we've lost over 50% of our agricultural biodiversity in the last century alone. Most of that is contributed to the Green Revolution, where they displaced local seeds. We fear that the new GMO revolution will even have a greater impact. So we must be working harder to increase longer, more diverse cropping systems to restore resilience to our operations. Currently, we're only using a very, very small percentage of the world's edible crops. And we also fundamentally coupled with this, are losing our capacity to put out public plant and animal breeds. This will be the building blocks of the future of organic agriculture. We need to urgently reinvigorate our funding support for classical plant breeding focused on adaptation to climate at each region. We need to train a next generation of plant breeders, and we need to make participatory on-farm plant breeding the norm in organic agriculture. So having heard all that, what are a few strategies that we need to apply going ahead? How do we stay ahead? How do we keep from being co-opted or eclipsed by other claims that add parts of our vision that we have not managed to incorporate into our standards? I think we must never forget that we are embedded into a very predatory food system. Farmers are pitted against buyers. Workers are pitted against farmers. Buyers are pitted against retailers. The consumers are pitted against the whole food system. It's not predatory by accident. It's not that the food system is broken. It's actually working just as it was designed. It's just not working for us. So I want to be clear that we cannot get to the shores of sustainability or avoid co-optation with just environmental standards alone. We must graft on fairness to our system. Workers can never have justice if farmers do not have justice, and neither workers or farmers can have justice unless we can appeal to the enlightened self-interest of the buyers and the consumers to pull these values all the way through the marketplace, just as we have so far with organic. That is the key. This is why many of us, when it became clear that we could not get all the values into the federal or international standards, we created the Agricultural Justice Project to try to build these standards so that we could graft these on when the time was right. So for those of us who have given the bloom of our youth to this movement, we see no real choice but to continue to innovate, to improve and evolve our organic systems, practice, and ethics to address these urgent needs, not only for ourselves, but for our children and the future of the planet. I'm very excited to be a part of several of these new marketplace initiatives, such as the regenerative organic that is being driven by a few old-time organic companies like Patagonia and Dr. Bronner's and Nature's Path, who now believe that now is the time to reset our market and to pilot these additional claims on organic farms. Stuart will tell you more about that in detail. It is essential that these leading companies step forward now and help us reset our marketplace, because the key to that is we cannot expect farmers to take these additional steps without tangible rewards for extra effort. So the three they're focusing on are soil building and carbon sequestration, fair pay and fair wages for workers, enhanced animal welfare. Those are three powerful pieces that are missing from our model that we need to find a way to graft on. I'm also working with a group of New England farmers who are trying to address the hydroponic crisis from their point of view. They are farmers who farm in the soil. They think it's unfair to have an hydroponic organic that is not labeled and they must compete with. They're looking at making a claim of grown in the soil. I'm also part of an international organic accreditation service that's looking at the global issues around organic fraud. We're looking to build ways to address high-risk places and put more effort there and provide more reward for those that are doing the right thing. So in summary, to wrap up, I would say these three pieces of fairness, of carbon sequestration, and animal welfare are key pieces to take steps of now, but we must simultaneously be closing the organic supply and demand gap. We must be building more sophisticated approaches for the next tier of transitioning organic farmers. They will not come with the same level of risk we did. They must see a clearer runway. We must shift our oversight to a risk-based model, as I said. We must reinvest in farmer-breeder participatory seed development and restore biodiversity and resilience to our farms. And we must ensure real opportunities for the next generation who will follow us. And finally, I think we need to embrace two more fundamental principles that are very powerful. One is full cost accounting. If you think about it, I like to say, well, you can pay a little more for organic now, or you can buy industrial and you'll pay 4 times. You'll pay at the grocery store, you'll pay with your taxes, you'll pay with your health, and you'll pay with the environment. If they had to internalize all the costs of the industrial model, it would not sustain itself. They externalize the pesticides onto the environment. They externalize all those costs onto taxes. It is invisible. It is not seen. All the consumer sees is cheap food and goes great. But they don't realize we're at a disadvantage in being able to make this case without full cost accounting. I was in southern Germany where they saw that the water municipality was spending all this money trying to get the pesticides out of the groundwater, and they said, you know, it would be cheaper if we just converted all the farmers around the water table to organic and paid for it than to keep trying to clean the chemicals out of the water. Full cost accounting. We must use this tool. And then finally, I was taught growing up that good fences made good neighbors. If my sheep got out and ate my neighbor's corn, I was responsible. I had to pay. My fence was supposed to be bull strong, pig tight, and horse high. But here we are being forced to pay for pesticide drift, to pay for GMO drift, to pay for pesticide testing, GMO testing, cost of segregation, cost of buffers, cost of planting late so we don't get cross-contamination. And I would build on Carrie's points about the danger of Roundup and say, yes, that's a focus, but in truth, it is really this cocktail of many different pesticides that we are being exposed to that have never been tested as a whole. And this really worries me. So I think it is fundamentally wrong for organic farmers to pay for the pollutions of others. We must enact the polluter pay principle. Chances in the U.S. are not so good at the moment. Maybe Canada could take the lead. So our theory of change is the right practice coupled with the right market rewards with supportive government policies. We have done that before. We must do it again. So since the very beginning, this has been a struggle for the soul of organic, which set out to be the sane alternative to agribusiness as usual. We must not allow ourselves to become that which we set out to be the alternative to. So with that, I would like to close by reading from one of my mentors. My wife was from Pennsylvania. I got to know Bob Rodale, who coined the word regenerative. I also got to know someone who is lesser known, Paul Keene. He started Walnut Acres in the 1940s. It was the first mail-order subscription organic farm that I ever heard of in the 1940s. And they not only grew the food, but processed it on the farm and mailed it out. And so Paul was very elegant, and I just want to read a couple of thoughts because I think he doesn't get enough credit. He said, "We have been cheered by the occasional appearance in the midst of third-generation Walnut Acre fed children, blooming, aware, alive, alert. Their bones come from our stones. Their flesh comes from our labor. This is a tremendous testimonial, a burden of responsibility, to see the results of one's efforts in living beings, as we have been permitted to do so. It is one of life's greatest heartwarming privileges. By being center of the organic food movement for many years, first helping to hold it together and later sharing in its strong forward thrust, We have seen the future sweep into the present with a tremendous rush. We have seen this. We hope that this renewed awareness represented by this movement will be one of saving elements so desperately needed now. As we see it, most people on this earth gain strength from closeness to the soil and from thinking in these terms. Perhaps these are basic needs on which continuing life on the planet is predicated. Perhaps it's always been this way, and we just are relearning what those who went before already knew. In the midst of so much rapid change that toss us like leaves in the wind, it is important to remember that the earth abides. It's not too late for us to get it right. If we work together, we can do so. You're all my heroes. Thank you very much.